Okay, Commissioners, the first item is a public meeting item. It's an application for a certificate of appropriateness in the Borough of Manhattan. It's 146-150 Wooster Street, located within the Soho Cast Iron Historic District. This is docket number 165750. It's a garage built or altered from an earlier structure in the early 20th century and a parking lot. And the application is to demolish the existing garage and construct a new building. This was first presented to the Commission on March 3rd, 2015.
Wooster, which is located on the east side of Wooster Street between West Houston and 10th Street in the Soho Cast Iron District. The site is two separate lots with an existing one-story garage building and vacant lot, and the proposal is to demolish the existing building and construct a new 7-story plus penthouse building on both lots. The application is also with an application for a special permit for modification of use in bulk pursuant to section 74712 of the zoning resolution of the City Planning Commission. This was initially presented at the public hearing on March 3rd, and the Commission expressed a consensus of support for the demolition of the existing building. However, there were concerns about the design of the new building base and cornice and the relationship of these elements to the masonry portion of the facade, as well as a concern about the lack of detailing of the windows. In response to these concerns, the proposal has been revised. The building base has been redesigned, reducing the width of the steel piers and adding additional piers at the ground floor to align with the masonry piers and cornice above. The cornice has been redesigned to feature additional articulation and detailing, and the plane has been adjusted so it aligns with the plane of the masonry. Additionally, the windows have been redesigned and are smaller in size with a full-size mullion surround and a steel reveal detail at each window bay. And the project representatives are here to elaborate on those revisions.
We'll reopen the hearing.
Good morning. I'm Daniel Silver, again, head of architecture and design for Cub Capital. We'll be showing our project here again. So after we met on the 3rd, we really spent some time trying to specifically address the concerns that were brought up here at the Commission. As Reba mentioned, we had gone 3 sort of primary elements that we tried to address, which was the masonry adjustments. There were certain elements that we wanted to change about the masonry to have it read much more as a solid surface with punched windows, make the windows be much more clear. We made adjustments to the cornice to emphasize some of the detailing there a bit more, brought it closer to the street wall, which was one of the concerns, have it more coplanar with the rest of the facade, and added a bit more detailing to sort of highlight the spacing between the windows. And finally, the base was a major concern for ours. We wanted to address the alignment issues from the piers above, and I'll go through all those elements now. So first place, we started with the window. We figured that the eyes are the window to the soul, so that a window must be the same for a building. So we wanted to emphasize the window more. There was concerns that it was not really reading like a window. Our first option here, we had very narrow framed windows and full-size glazing. We also had a detail on the left with the limestone from the piers that went right into the glazing. Our goal initially, we were very much inspired by the large windows in these Soho buildings, so we wanted to sort of emphasize that. But after meeting with everybody here, we realized it's very important to have that frame of the window be clear and sort of define that space, have it read as much more punched window. So the options on the right is our adjustments here. So we have gone with a window with a full mullion around the perimeter. We've decreased the size of the window on both the top and bottom and on the left and right. And in that area, after removing the sort of limestone trim detail, we've added a steel detail of the same color as the base and the cornice to kind of tie those elements through the base, through the masonry, and through the cornice above. We feel that it helps have that element, that window, stand as sort of a clean element within the punch masonry. Another key element that we worked on was to have the piers read as a rhythm as the element across the facade, but we found that the option on the left, which we had showed on the third, had our piers terminating into the base. And there was definitely a lot of comments about that disjunction between the masonry and the base. And we felt that perhaps those piers with the limestone and the brick terminating into the base was a bit too abrupt and too sharp of a termination of those elements. So for our piers, we had mimicked the element that we had above, which is to wrap the limestone around the bottom window as we had done on the top window, which we feel actually provides us with a street wall of masonry that has these punched elements where the spandrel and the glazing are sort of set within. It kind of gives a much cleaner surface for the brick. Here are just some details. Another element that we focused on with the masonry is we had thinned out a little bit of that street wall, so brought the windows closer so that they're more, the edges are a bit more apparent for people on the street, and some of that detail comes a bit through. So the piers themselves are slightly less narrow, or less deep rather, and these are just some of the details. Same patterning, same use of limestone on the edges of the pier, brick in between. A major element that we focused on was the alignment. Our base before was, we wanted to really highlight the Soho cast iron district where they have these very clear bases, very clear cornices with masonry in between for the buildings that are masonry found in the Soho cast iron district. With our option on the left, which was the first one we had showed on the third, it became apparent that there was not too much connection between the buildings above. So what we had focused on was maintaining the alignment of those piers, not only through the cornice above, which we had from the beginning, but also make sure that was carried through down below. One thing we were drawn to with many of the masonry buildings is their side piers to the edges of the buildings are often a bit wider. It's a nice way to have a large masonry building terminate at the sidewalk level. It gives a good amount of mass. So our pilasters on both the north and south side of the building are nearly double the width of the interior pilasters here. We also worked on sort of isolating the retail elements to the left and the right, commercial elements, and our residential entrance there in the middle is more clearly defined. Here is a detail of our pilasters and our base. Another element we wanted to focus on was this sort of scale and the detail of what we were proposing for the most sort of tangible and tactile element of this building for people on the street, which is the base. So echoing what we had been inspired by with the cornice and also the base itself with the sort of articulated ribbon that we were finding in a lot of the sort of cast iron details, we have utilized that on the pilasters for the base level. We also added a bit more sort of detail and kind of delicacy to it so that these elements of the pilasters aren't reading so sort of massive and out of scale with the rest of not only buildings to the north and the south, but just sort of So our pilasters have the remnant of those piers, the fins above, and also we really like the way the rhythm of these piers carry across the entirety of the base. They also carry down here through this storefront bulkhead where that rhythm carries across the entire facade. This is a detail drawings of the pilasters. We wanted to have a bit of a cascade here so that there was a bit more kind of tangible detail and scale, a little more humanly scaled, as opposed to our previous option that may have been too flat and too massive. And these are detail of the pilasters themselves with the sort of vertical fins that run up the length of the facade. Here's a view of the base with the masonry above. This image we feel sort of highlights what we're working on most, which is carrying that alignment through of the piers, the masonry above, that was a very strong inspiration from us from the beginning. But having the limestone wrap around the edge kind of provides a nice clean break between the masonry and the steel base below, but carrying that alignment down through.
Could you just remind us
Sure.
what the material is on that base?
Yes, the base is steel, painted steel.
Is it see-through? Is it fins that you can see through? Or is there glass behind that steel? or-
Yes, right here in the storefront, that area is glass behind. This here will all be solid. One of the things we were drawn to is a lot of the Soho cast iron district buildings have some of the grading on the lower level, and the way that sort of light casts through that is really kind of beautiful detail. So we wanted to bring that in and not have the facade read as massive, but still have the strong elements of the pilasters. This is a detail of the cornice. Previous option on the left and our new proposed version on the right. Here you can see the masonry wraparound that we have utilized on the base. One of the concerns with the cornice from the third was it became too much of a separate entity. We wanted it to read as a separate piece, but we didn't want it to be, you know, a separate element entirely from the building. So we had brought, in our new option, we have brought the wall of the cornice element to the street wall so that it doesn't have the setback that it did on the original version. And we also wanted to bring down some of the elements and some of the sort of shadow lines and details of the cornice itself into the texture of the brick. So we have some of these some of these steel cascading elements carry down, which kind of sort of hint a little bit at what happens below in the base with the fins that and for the pilasters below. These are our drawings of the cornice. As you can see here now, we have a kind of continuous street wall where the cornice floor is with the cornice above. The size of the cornice, just by moving the entirety of that floor closer to the street wall, our cornice is now slightly less deep, but it actually reads clear from the street wall. It doesn't seem as dominating. Here are two details of our new proposed cornice. We really wanted to have the sort of texture. You have the bricks there on the table, the ones we're using, the handmade bricks. And one of the elements we really are so drawn to with the masonry buildings in the Soho cast iron district is the texture and the detail of the masonry. And we wanted to have a little bit of a dialogue between that and the steel elements above. So we've brought in a lot more of that here.
Okay. All right. Questions? Are there any questions for the applicant? Yes, Roberta?
Just in terms of the base, so the piece with the glass is in front of or just below the storefront? It's part of the storefront.
So this area right here, the glass is behind it, and these fins will be in front. So there's sort of a layer of this steel articulated metalwork, and then the glazing.
But it's one
behind.
piece of glass, so it's the same piece of glass from the storefront that's going down behind.
Yes, correct. It is a single piece of glazing.
And what is it at the top of the storefront panel? What is
Right
it?
here, that is a solid piece of the same steel, same material as the pilasters and the cornice above.
And so is that what's supposed to represent or
Oh, well,
reference the
it's I mean, traditionally with the cornice, there's always a bit of entablature before it. So we didn't want to have the glazing just meet right into the cornice itself. We wanted to provide a bit of you know, sort of structure and base for the masonry above to rest upon. So we had included this horizontal element here where the plasters sort of rise up into before it begins into the cornice itself.
Is it not a sign band?
No, it's
Not a sign band. There's no sign band. There's no signage on the building.
There are There'll be signs above the doors. We figured the glazing here could be a position for interior signage.
But I saw in an earlier version, an earlier image, there was like blade signs.
There are blade signs, yes. Oh, sorry. There are blade signs above each doorway. Pointer's not a bit, but right there and there.
All right, are there other questions? Any other questions? Okay, so we can close the hearing, and we can go to discussion. I think that the current proposal actually addresses several of the concerns that we had last time. I know that many commissioners had raised the relationship of different parts of the building and whether they were coalescing and really unifying themselves in some way, particularly the columns, the cornices, the base. And I think that in terms of the geometry and the proportions, I think they've actually gone a long way towards doing that. This is a building which is obviously modern, that it's, I think, purposefully using materials in a way that reflects or resonates very historical parts of buildings, but is using it in a somewhat different way. And I myself think that's it's good to see different forms of architecture that reflect parts of the historic district, but interpret material and a different sort of sensibility, but still is consistent with the character. So I think, at least in my mind, I think this design moves very close towards finding it appropriate. And I think, there could be details, but I would say overall, I could find this building very much appropriate for the district. Other comments? Yes. Sure.
Yeah, I'm a fan of this building. I think it's a very interesting building, and generally, before I thought it was appropriate, and I might have voted for it. I've forgotten what exactly I said even. But I think the building has improved. I hope the architect thinks so, that we're not just meddling in what is, I think, a very creative process that you've come to. But I do think the building has been improved by the alignment issue that you've rectified, let's call it, and I think the very elegant way that the building now meets the street with the bulkhead, a very interesting interpretation of a bulkhead which we see all over this district, but now is interpreted in a way which is consistent with the vocabulary that you're bringing up, which is a good thing. I think finally the cornice and the whole top floor of the building is much improved and integrated in a really beautiful and lyrical way. My only hesitation, and it's a mild one, and I'm thinking to be deferential to an architect who's clearly thought this through very carefully, and I don't think that we want to pick it to death, but I would just suggest maybe you think about eliminating that lower cascade and ending up with just the top two, which to my eye would be more proportional. But that's my only issue. We'll wait and see what other people think.
Yes, other comments? Yes,
I agree with what Fred said, and I also, my reaction to the cascade was that that division could be solved by simply having the ribbed pilaster, but incising a rebate at the locations where you have the step backs on that corbel. Try it out, see what the staff thinks.
all right, other comments? Yes, Diana?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I came in late, but I've seen the previous presentation, and I agree with Commissioner Bland's comments. Thank you.
I just
Yes.
have a question. How would you describe the style of your building?
Okay, we have to reopen the hearing
Oh,
for
I'm
that
sorry.
answer.
Oh, it's not,
We-
because
We had closed
We
it, but that's
closed it.
okay. If you
Sorry, sorry.
you'd like that answered?
I'd love it, I'd love to hear it.
All right. Yes, please come forward. We're reopening the hearing.
Well, the question of style is always a challenging one to answer. I feel that the cast iron district has been defined by multitudes of styles. All of the cast iron work was across every genre up to that point, up to the 1860s architecturally, and they were assembled almost as a kit of parts. So for our sort of interpretation of the style of the neighborhood, where we started from, was more of the craft and the texture and the materiality of the items that we found that we loved, with the visual kind of cues and inspiration from the style that we've seen. So I can't say a specific style because I don't know if there is one. I think style is a challenging question, but we were very much drawn to the elements that I described above. That's what our inspiration was from the start.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to close the hearing. All right, any other comments, or we can move to decision? Yes, Roberta?
I think that the proposal today is really a great step forward. I'm not to say I didn't like anything about the other, but this is, I think, both how you've done the windows, the fact that they are how they are and pop out and are very distinctive, and that the columns or the piers do align with spaces above. I think that this is a great improvement, and so I think it's a great building. My only concern is still that little piece that's at the top of the storefront. I don't know, it's like it's narrow, it's not, well, I don't know. But fine, I accept that overall, that maybe with just the comments that were made in terms of the base, that this is fine.
All right, any other comments? Yes,
I was not a major fan of the previous application, and I think that it has been improved. I think it still has this kind of Yamasaki Edstone quality to it that I don't think makes it really, still feels funny to me, but I think it's well within the bounds of what I would consider to be appropriate for the district. It pushes the right buttons. So I could vote for it.
okay, very good. Any other comments? All right, Fred, would you like to read that?
Sure.
Thanks.
Whoa. Lots of reading here. In the matter of 146 to 150 Wooster Street in the Soho Cast Iron Historic District, the application is to demolish the existing garage and construct a new building.
Bless you.
I recommend approval, noting that the existing building was not one of the buildings for which the district was designated, and therefore its demolition will not detract from the special historic and architectural character of the historic district. That the plane of the proposed front facade will align with the facades of the adjacent properties, thereby reinforcing the street wall, a significant, consistent feature of the Soho Cast Iron Historic District. That the height of the street wall is consistent with the street wall of other buildings on the block, which has a variety of heights. That the floor-to-ceiling heights will approximate the scale of neighboring properties, helping to maintain a harmonious relationship with the neighboring buildings. That the front facade will utilize the vocabulary of base, shaft, and termination capital, recalling the typical facade composition of the early 20th century commercial buildings located throughout the historic district. That the modular organization, the predominant expression of structure, and the palette of materials and finishes will be consistent with other historic masonry buildings with cast iron elements in the Soho Cast Iron Historic District. That the planes of the facade components and alignment of vertical piers will visually reflect the support of the upper floors of the building base, that the variation of masonry textures and finishes and the projections and profiles of framing elements will recall in a contemporary manner the ornamentation of historic masonry buildings throughout the historic district, that the placement of the windows set back from the masonry piers will be consistent with the depth of windows at historic buildings throughout this historic district, that the overall thickness and profiles of the upper floor window framing in conjunction with their shadow lines and their contrast in color from the surrounding masonry will help the windows recall the depth and articulation of windows typically found throughout the historic district, that the composition of ground floor elements, including columns, display windows, bulkheads, entrance doorways, and a cornice will be compatible with the commercial character of the bases of buildings throughout the district, that the proportions of the framing and glazing and the amount of profiled detailing at the ground floor will be consistent with typical proportions and levels of articulation at the ground floors of buildings within this historic district, that the design and details of the main building entrance will maintain a subtle prominence and harmonious proportional relationship with the building in keeping with the character of primary entrances to industrial buildings throughout this historic district, that the signage will be typical in terms of placement, dimensions, and materials, and its size and quantity will not overwhelm the building, that the setback, penthouse level, and rooftop bulkheads and mechanicals are simple in silhouette and will only be seen from public thoroughfares over a side facade at a distance and within the context of a varied streetscape featuring a taller building in the background, that the lot line facades will be in keeping with secondary facades at buildings of this size throughout the district in terms of materials, finish, and simple detailing, and that the simple design and step massing of the rear of the building will be compatible with the utilitarian character of secondary facades of the surrounding properties and will not be visible from any public thoroughfare. We recommend that the applicant restudy the articulation of the lower step or eliminate it in consultation with the staff.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? This application's approved.
Okay, Commissioners, the second item